Marcuccilli. I'm the Director of Parks and Recreation, and I want to thank each and every one of you for spending your evening with us to help give us some feedback on Thomas Marcuccilli Nature Park, which is one of our newest parks here in Carmel and in Northeast Carmel. So we're excited to have you here. I also want to extend a big thank you to Harvest Church, which allowed us to graciously host this meeting here so that we're a little bit closer to the park. You actually look out the windows, you can see the park, which is pretty exciting. This is a very exciting process for us because we're at still the beginning stages of coming up for a vision of what Thomas Marcuccilli Nature Park is going to be. And first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the name Thomas Marcuccilli Nature Park. It was donated to the Carmel Clay Board of Parks and Recreation to be a public park from the developer of Legacy, and the primary owner of the developer company chose to name the property since they donated it after his father-in-law. Mr. Marcuccilli was a co-founder of Star Bank, which is based here in Indiana, so has some great Hoosier Hoops connections, excuse me. So that's sort of where the name came from. But when you look at the lay of the land, most of the parks within the Carmel Clay Park system are just simply called a park. But what we recognize with this unique property is that it's a little bit different than most of our other parks. It's one that is not going to support major development. I mean, there's no way, because of the type of soil conditions, which you'll hear a little bit more about shortly, be able to support major infrastructure. You're not going to be able to ever see a building like the Monon Community Center or Water Park, or even a facility like we have in Founders Park or West Park. It's just not suitable for that. It's also not suitable for the types of playgrounds that we typically build within Carmel Clay Parks and Recreation. So definitely not anything like Westermeyer Commons and Central Park, but even not like one of our smaller parade grounds at Founders Park or Cary Grove Park. You're just not going to see a playground in here because, again, the soil conditions won't support it. So we purposely named it Nature Park to help set the expectations as to what this park can be. And in our park system, we've had some questions about, and there's some signage in the woods call it a nature preserve. And it's like, is it a nature preserve? Is it a nature park? Well, nature preserve under Indiana law is a very special designation, and anyone can call their property a nature preserve, but this isn't a Indiana classified nature preserve, so there's no regulations that govern it. Under our park system, we do have several different classifications of park. We have regional parks, we have community parks, we have neighborhood parks, but we also have a classification that's called nature preserve. And that's what we would call this particular park as well, which means it's for pretty much passive experiences, and it's one to celebrate the nature that the park has. So that's really our vision for this park. But what tonight is about, and we've already, in mid-April, we had some focus groups and got some preliminary ideas from different constituencies and some neighbors as well as to what the park could be, what they'd like to see in the park, what they want it. And what we're presenting tonight are some different ideas based on what we heard and interpreting that. You're going to see three different concepts, and I want to stress the park isn't necessarily going to look like any of these concepts. What we have found in the past in our planning efforts is that when we're talking about things verbally, words mean different things to different people. So what we find is putting things pen to paper and giving some concepts based on what we think we heard so that we can start talking about it. Did we get it right? Did we get it wrong? So we're going to be asking, and especially through the worksheets that hopefully each of you received, getting that feedback so we can understand what you like and what you don't like. So that's what tonight's about. Additionally, I do want to recognize Casey May, who will be leading us through most of tonight's conversation. She's with MKSK. She's the design team that Carmel Clay Parks and Recreation engaged to help lead us through this process. MKSK is also involved in some of the other planning efforts in this general region. They were hired by Conner Prairie to develop their site master plan, so they're aware of what's going on over there. They were hired by Carmel Utilities to design the looks of the well houses that are going to be on the site. That's not part of this project, but they have an understanding and are working with Carmel Utilities on those projects as well. So she'll lead us through it. I also want to make a couple introductions of some park board members we have here tonight. First of all, I have Mark Westermeyer, who has been on our park board for a couple years now, it seems like, and he also was my predecessor, so I'm thrilled to have him on the park board. And then we also have, I just had a brain fart. Jessica, I am so sorry, Jessica. Jessica Beer. No race for me this year. So Dr. Jessica Beer has been on the park board for almost 3 years now, and has she actually lives here on the east side of Carmel, and has been an incredible breadth of information, and she brings some incredible research about play, which is also very important for Carmel Clay Parks Recreation. Also would like to recognize Judy Hagan, who is a former park board member and also the former trustee of Clay Township. So she's been instrumental in the development of the park system over the years. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Casey, and she'll start leading us through the process.
Definitely. And in the spirit of recognition, I also have a few other MKSK people here today. Jacob Deason is sitting right here, and he worked on a lot of the preparation of the graphics and conceptual work that we'll be looking at today. And then Abby is here as well, and she's been working on the community engagement piece here. We've had a lot of community engagement, actually, a lot of focus groups that have been incredibly beneficial to this process. And the site itself is complex just in what it brings, you know, the muck soils and the specific sort of constructibility issues around the park, which is why it does exist today. You know, 63 acres in the middle of a highly sought after land area, and the way development is working around here, this piece of property will just continue to be, you know, more special as the area develops around it. So with that, I think we'll just jump into the presentation for the evening. This is a picture of the park, but again, we do have it right outside the window, so that is a nice way to be able to relate to it for those who are here.
And question for the members of the public came, how many of you live within the legacy development or in close proximity? So most of the folks in present tonight, and I can't see hands raised in Cyberland, but I'm presuming we have a few out there too. But regardless of where you live, we're happy to have you.
Excellent, yeah. So just to get started, we wanted people to understand where we are in the process of creating a master plan to guide the vision of the development of this park or this area as a park. We organized the project into 3 main phases. And the first one we've actually kind of gotten through. It's called Setting the Foundation. And it's basically a time period where we collect different survey information, create a base, and understand more about the soils and the topography and what the property is and what its limitations are. The second phase, which is where we're at now, is where we study the opportunities and the concepts about how this park could be developed. And we're at this first bubble at this point. Tonight, we're talking about the 3 concepts that have been developed. And in July, we will take all the feedback that we hear from all the different entities, and we'll fold it into a refined concept. And like Michael said, it oftentimes will be sort of the best parts and pieces from all of these ideas, in addition to ideas that we didn't think about and put on the paper tonight. And so as we go through this process tonight of talking about these ideas, it's really helpful for us to understand what you do really like and what you see that you really like, but also the things that you really don't like. That's also wonderful things to share with us to help guide the process. Once we will arrive at that refined concept in July, and we'll have another point for feedback from the community, we will move into sort of this phase 3, where we'll continue to refine and report and create a nice master plan document.
Exactly. And once we have that document, a draft master plan prepared, it'll go to the park board for their review and comment. And then ultimately, it'll be adopted and become the vision by which we use to guide the future development of the park. At that point, it also gives us the ideas of how much it may cost to develop the vision that's created. And it becomes my job to work with the community leaders to find the funding to make it a reality. So, the reality is most of this park isn't going to be developed within the next year or 2. It's probably within a couple of years that you start seeing the major development. There may be some small elements, but for the most part, we're probably a couple of years out before you start seeing any significance. Yes, sir.
So the concept you are rolling out is July. So when's the point design when you think that'll roll out?
So the idea of a consolidated plan will be July. That's what we're shooting for. And
explain to me what you mean by point design. Oh, okay. So sort of construction documents of, yeah.
so
Yeah.
the next step after that will be once we have funding in place, because I'm not going to go into that, but probably we'll start that within a year and a half to 2 years.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that question. So let's talk about the location and sort of the history of this site. I'll start with the location, and then maybe Michael, you can fill in a little bit on the history of it. The site and the park site itself is, it has some limited access really to the major arteries that border it. It does have two major arteries that border it, 146th Street to the north and River Road to the east. There's also the Cherry Creek Boulevard, which sort of runs here to the south, and then Community Drive on the west side. But even within those corridors, you can see there's just sections of those roads where the park actually interfaces with. So along Community Drive, there's this really nice existing woodland there, and that would be a sort of a moment of interaction with the park. And then on the north side, there's, oh, excuse me, on the north side, there actually isn't a great moment of interaction with a major corridor except for here on this section of 146. However, it's sort of where the cars are starting to approach the intersection. And so it's not seen as a really great high visibility point, because really people should be focused on the driving at that point. And so there's some limitations there as well. At the corner of 146th and River Road, there's a commercial development. And then south of that on River Road is Harvest Church, where we're sitting at today. Harvest Church owns the property basically from this pedestrian sidewalk south, all along River Road and down to the residential neighborhood and development here. So from River Road, there's actually a bit of topography and a little bit of a lack of visibility actually in this section of the roadway to the park. And so really what we're left with as far as visibility wise from the major corridor of River Road is there's sort of this section here where you can see into the park. All that said, the park is a very interior focused piece of land at this point, and the residents and the church and the commercial properties that border it have this really lovely relationship and view to that green space. There is Connor Prairie to the east of River Road, and there's future development that's planned there. A lot of educational components are being planned there related to the river ecology, the river corridor, as well as innovative farming and food practices. And so there's a real nice civic amenity that's going to continue to grow and expand right there across River Road, as well as the extended White River Greenway trail system. And so there's sort of a notion that it would be nice to provide some connectivity to this future park and that trail system. So beyond that, I'd love for Michael to kind of go into a little bit more of the history of.
So stepping back a little bit, the history of the land. It was originally part of Earlman College and Connor Prairie. When those two entities split up, it ended up getting sold off, which part of that opened up for this particular development. This area is part of a planned unit development, which was ultimately approved by the city council. I believe it was in December 2006 or early 2007. And part of that planned unit development, or PUD, it actually always envisioned this being kind of an open space. It originally was going to be part of the common area, but looking at some of the minutes from the Plan Commission and discussions, the idea was that this would always be an amenity that is open to the greater community, not just to the neighbors. And also envisioned within it, and we found several different plans that were presented to the city over the years that showed kind of the same type of things that we're envisioning for today, which are a variety of passive trails, potentially some wetlands and other opportunities like that. maybe some small picnic areas, those type of things. And you'll see that the concepts that we come with maybe don't look exactly like those, but certainly share a lot of similar elements. The plan unit development also included within the actual document approved by the City Council were a number of photos that gave some visual cues as to what they were envisioning for the space. They called it characteristic photos or exhibits. And as I was looking at those a little bit closer, they look pretty familiar because they were all from West Park. So the inspiration for some of the ideas they had were based on assets that Carmel Clay Parks and Recreation is already responsible for. So there sort of seems like, okay, their idea was something that is what we already do. And the areas they showed were not the heavily developed areas where the playground and stuff. It was everything, if you're familiar with West Park in the back part where you've got the aggregate trails through the prairies and you've got some forested areas. It was all very reflective of the very passive components of the park. So that was the idea that was presented and ultimately adopted by the City Council, which became part of the approval process for ultimately what is now all the components of Legacy.
Excellent. Yeah. And beyond that too, I mean, the design team wanted to study too, even not ancient, but the very far past history of the site, in that this area was probably formed when the glaciers receded and made this sort of depression. And this depression has always probably supported a pretty unique landscape, having its own specific resources that would draw communities to it for its just specificity in sort of what it was. So the site just kind of continues to reveal different layers of wonderful history. And in fact, we believe at this point, we've sort of worked with anthropologists and archaeologists at Ball State to better understand that this is probably very full and rich with artifacts from tribal engagement with the site. And so there's layers of that will sort of fold in information through the presentation as well. So there's just a really rich history here around the site. One other thing we should mention, in case people aren't aware of it too, is the Carmel the Wellhead sites that are close to.
So in 2007, Carmel Utilities, working with the developer, identified 2 locations for wells that will service the public water supply here in Carmel. And those were actually the sleeves that are out there, or the casings that were out there, were installed in 2007. One's located here in the south, and the other one is located there to the north. We've identified the locations. We're considering them in the plans, but like I said, the actual wells are under the jurisdiction of Carmel Utilities. They have easements and control that property. Even though we own it, they have the easements. So, but that's why they're kind of dashed out on here, because we don't have complete say on what goes there. That's something we're doing in collaboration with Carmel Utilities.
We can always come back to this slide. It's actually pretty useful to see, what exists here today. But as we moved on, again, that first phase, we really did a lot of deep study of the site, and we studied things like the invasive vegetation on the site, and started to, in hopes of developing a plan to tackle that. We studied the scenic value of the site, and that graphic in particular is one that I really enjoy, because what it is studying is really how the surrounding area and the white would represent more of a developed area, and then the green areas are probably a little bit more pastoral looking, very green. And so I think it's really interesting to think about, as you travel along River Road, how there's these different points in the urban grid to sort of come and interact with this green space, but also that how very different it feels along the roadway there when you have green on either side. And just how people will experience entering the site from the larger network and neighborhood and community. We did study circulation of the vehicles as well as the pedestrians around the site, and we did that in order to start to hone in on where are the best places to maybe welcome people into the park experience. We definitely studied the soils of the site because the soils are one of the major determinants of why the site is the way it is today. But also, what can we even build here feasibly? What kind of infrastructure can we put in a site like this? A gravel path, a gravel trail, which is one of the most basic elements of a park infrastructure, actually becomes a lot more complicated. So while a trail on a regular park might be 6 inches deep, the trail here might end up being 24, 30 inches deep or more in some cases.
And she's talking about the base for
Yeah,
it.
so the depth of the crushed stone, compacted crushed stone to make that path happen and work. And so those are some of the things that we started studying with the soil typology of the site. And beyond that, we studied plant communities that exist and the hydrology of the site, as well as the topography. And before we jump into the conceptuals, I think it is important that for those who don't understand or aren't as familiar with the site, understand that the site in general, everything around it contextually sits about 8 feet above. The park itself is a bit of a depression. And you can see that actually in this diagram, in that the green is showing the lower areas, and then the red is showing the higher. And within that too, you can see that there's a bit of yellow that sort of starts to pop up through here. And that is really showing us that there's a bit of a ridge in the middle of this depressed landscape. That ridge is one that the anthropologists have identified as probably being one of the more active areas on the site as far as where people would have interacted with these two depressed muck landscapes. And those landscapes would have been something like a fen or a marsh or a sedge meadow. And not everybody knows what that means or what that looks like. We actually do have some pictures up here on the board that we can look at later, but I'll describe it for those who are on virtually as well. Whereas a prairie tends to be pretty tall, sometimes 5, 6, 8 feet tall. These types of landscapes on this soil, the soil would support a lot lower statured growth and lots of flowers, lots of color in most cases, but they tended to be, and they do exist to this day, I'm not talking about them like they don't exist, but they tend to be really comfortable for humans to interact with because you can see long distances, but still be immersed in a landscape. And so it really is kind of a special experience, or possibly in this park, maybe an opportunity to create some scale or exhibit of a historic landscape, which was probably a lot more prevalent, in this area prior to agricultural draining and channelization of the rivers. So we've identified that as a potential opportunity through analyzing the different conditions on the site.
So as we go into the planning process and sort of helping us guide as we develop the different concepts that we'll be presenting tonight, we identified several goals and objectives for this overall development of the park and the planning process. Based on again, the lay of the land and what the land was telling us, as well as some of the focus groups we've already had. And the first goal was to preserve the unique nature and experience of the trail. It's a special place. It has a different type of beauty than what you see in most of our parks throughout the community or throughout the area. So we want to celebrate that and make sure that we preserve that type of feel within it. Again, the idea of it being a nature park. The second one is, because of the lay of the land, we want to make sure that we accommodate passive usage, as opposed to that active usage with the playgrounds and the more built infrastructure. This one is a place that's going to be a more contemplative park to go to, walking the trails, watching the animals and wildlife, maybe doing some photography, those types of things. The third was to provide educational opportunities and sort of that storytelling of the site. Again, the ecological story of the site, but also the human touch and elements of the site, going back to the Native Americans that were first here through early settlement to today, and maybe comparing and contrasting a little bit the histories of how, especially ecologically, the site was managed. Fourth, excuse me, is connectivity. And we use that term connectivity pretty broadly. Connectivity, of course, connecting to the infrastructure and the trail networks or the roadways so that people can get to the park. Connectivity to the neighbors, recognizing that we do have neighbors in close proximity all around it and making sure that connectivity to them is appropriate. Connectivity to other potential partners like Harvest Church, which we'll talk about some potential partnerships that we're discussing with them. Nothing that's guaranteed, but they've been wonderful and listening and interested in seeing how they might be able to contribute to the park. So those type of connectivities. And the fifth goal is using an innovative approach to this entire process. So part of it is the public input process, ensuring that it's a very inclusive process. Part of it is working with Harvest Church. There's not a lot of examples of park systems and churches working together. And we think that that's a unique dynamic and something that could be really beneficial to everyone involved in the project. Another thing, and she's talked a little bit about the Native American history, we've established a relationship and have an agreement with Ball State University with their Applied Anthropology Lab, which is actually going to be working with us and helping us do outreach to the Native Americans that maybe have a connection to this site over history. They have connections to over 50 federally registered tribes throughout the country. And they've already reached out to the tribes that may have some history in this area. And we're seeing how much they might want to be involved in the process and help us inform, especially that educational component, as opposed to, us trying to interpret how they use the land or manage the land. We'd like to have them be the ones that tell us how they use the land so that story is coming from them. So we're very excited about that partnership. And it's not a lot of examples, especially at the municipal level of that type of interaction with tribes. So we're pretty excited about that.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Yep. So with that, we'll jump into the three concepts. And just a reminder, these are sort of, we've really tried to spread out what the options are, as we study, for instance, where can parking go or where can a restroom facility go? We really tried to kind of create and identify as many options as we could, just so that we can get your feedback on it. And so that you could tell us which ones are optimal, which ones are not so optimal. So each one of these concepts will describe a unique arrangement of those elements. The first concept, we really wanted the overall infrastructure of the park to be guided by how would we tell the stories of the site, thinking about the landscape as a place where a lot of stories have occurred. It's been the scenery for a lot of different people through history. And so what would it look like if our trail system supported and our gathering nodes and where they were located supported that? And some ways that could develop over time as this actually, became a park, if this were the approach, is that maybe historically we would find that something did happen in a specific place on the site. And so, of course, we would develop a node around that. And it's not so far-fetched to imagine that we could actually find and get that information, because that's how rich this particular place is in artifacts and in the local knowledge of what's happened here. So moving into the actual concept, what you find here is there's sort of a central node in the center of this park. And thank you, Michael. And actually, I'm going to just shift to the diagram, because what we've done is we've sort of made a diagram that relates directly to the plan. And you can see that the plan is sort of grayed back there. And this diagram does start to identify all these different elements that are consistent across all the concepts: where we put a restroom facility, where we are welcoming people into the site, where the trail system is and how it's laid out, where we're considering a great location for vehicles to enter the site and to sort of welcome in the larger network and community, where the parking is, how large it is, how it's configured. And then we've sort of made an arrangement of a diverse scale of gathering nodes. And when you think about these gathering nodes, we have small, medium, and large. And small could be as small as just accommodating 1 to 2 people, like perhaps even just a bench would be a small gathering node. Whereas the large would accommodate 10 to 12 people and could be, maybe developed into something that supports, whatever activity kind of rises to the surface as wanting supported. So in this scheme, you can see that we've identified 2 large gathering nodes, and one would be in collaboration with and on church property at the sort of higher level. And we would imagine that space being developed with the church to sort of be a shared space that they could use for events, but also people who come visit the park could use. And they're pretty open right now too about how their playground is used and welcoming people in. So it kind of fits within the model of how they're interacting with the community currently. And then we also identified a gathering space down in the center of the park in the more immersive area. And obviously that's also located in that area that might be really rich for interpretation of some artifacts and things that might have happened there on that ridge. Going back to the trail system layout, you can see it sort of breaks the park into quadrants, like a northeast, a northwest, a southeast, southwest quadrant. The loop trail, as you look at it, each scheme really does show a loop trail, and that loop trail is about 1.5 miles long. So that makes each of these quadrants about 1/4 of a mile, so about the size of a track, if you can kind of start to put that into perspective, because this is actually quite a large park. It's 63 acres, and it will be the 3rd largest park in Carmel's park system. It is about half the size of
West Park,
West Park,
and not quite, a little over 1/3 the size of Central Park.
Yeah. So it is a nice, expansive landscape. And so this, I think this trail system for me ranks pretty high on the wayfinding aspect. There's a central node, and then there's, kind of an east, west, and north and south way of kind of getting out of that node. And so I think there's that to note. Moving to sort of the parking and how we're studying the parking in this scheme, we're looking at the entrance here off of River Road. And in this scenario, there would be the largest parking scheme being suggested, and it would be shared use parking with the church. There'd be a drop off and a restroom kind of trailhead associated with that. And the location of any parking scheme up in this area in collaboration with the church would be a great spot to sort of serve the future expansion of the trail system on the east side of River Road. And so that's kind of a plus there too. Beyond that, we just really started to identify specific nodes and places where it would make sense to provide access down into the park. Those access points are pretty substantial suggestions in that there is a bit of grade to navigate to get down to park grade. So there'd be switchback, trails to get you in an accessible way, down to park grade. I'm going to go on. I want to move through these concepts at a high level because we can always come back and answer specific questions. But moving on, the next concept is what we call and reference landscape forward. And in this concept, we really wanted to follow the lead of the landscape itself and the ecologies that exist there, what the soil and hydrology and topography of the site is sort of asking it and wanting it to be. And so in this scheme, you'll start to see some shapes that are not man-made. They're more like the soil diagram where they're very organic. And the suggestion is that within these soil types, different plant communities might want to be supported, or different types of landscapes might want to be developed. What if your trail really did match and follow the shape of those soil placements that exist? And how would that start to look? How would that start to feel? And we do see some benefit there too with how the path would then help the parks group kind of define areas for maintenance, because these different types of communities would have different maintenance needs as well. And so we wanted to see what the site would look like if we started to follow those types of forms. And so we started to get something that looks a bit like this, which does feel, a lot more integrated in a way. Maybe not, the infrastructure of the park doesn't stand out as much. Moving to the conceptual diagram, the major differences that I start to see here is that instead of having sort of 4 quadrants to the park, you start to have a multitude of scaled spaces that are defined by the trail layout. And we also would anticipate that in a trail system layout like this, that you might end up having a more diverse set of different landscapes and plant environments that you might experience. The other thing that stands out is the way that the trail system starts to support that central ridge that naturally exists. And in this concept too, I like how we started to explore some shading, some tree plantings. Now, anything we do out there as far as tree plantings go is going to be a bit experimental because the soils don't really want to support tree growth. And that's why it's pretty wide open right now. But there are some specific tree types that can do well and that it would be worthwhile exploring. So thinking back to more ancient times, this might have supported like a cypress or a locust grove environment. And so that's another example of kind of a plant community that could be introduced that could provide some shade, because we are aware that it's going to be a very sunny, hot space that would warrant having some shade.
Additionally, historically, it wouldn't have been surprising to find trees sort of around the bowl, not in the bowl, but sort of the edging of the bowl. You probably, pre-settlement, you probably would have seen sort of this sort of growth of trees and then this unique depression with the different types of landscapes in it. So, around the edges, there's probably some opportunities for some trees as well, if that's ultimately what seems appropriate to do.
Yeah, and we haven't focused on that as much in previous presentations, but you will notice between the 3 concepts shown that we do sort of show, heavier plantings around the edge of trees and some that are a little bit more open. And so we're open to feedback on those types of things. And
additionally, sometimes we'll use plantings to provide screening so that it helps provide sort of separation between the public spaces and people's yards. Sometimes those can be trees, but they don't always have to be trees. They also could be shrubs, for example. So different types of native shrubs that could be around the side. So, if the idea is, we really want to see into the park, but, we want that buffer, we could use a different type of landscaping that provides that without blocking the view. So those are options as well.
Yeah, and in that way, the topography does really support a pretty nice arrangement, whereas someone on top of on the higher plateau can maybe see out and over the activity of a trail that could be hidden with vegetation, but also the topography itself would work to hide sort of the experience of the trail user from the wonderful views that the residents now have and want to continue to have. So back to the scheme, let's talk about the parking in the scheme. It's represented on the church property again, but this time it's not being represented as a combined parking scenario, more of what you would typically experience when you come to a Carmel Park. There would be signage and you would know that you're entering into a Carmel Park. There'd be a trail node associated with that, with the restroom facility and a drop off. And something we haven't talked about yet, but one thing that's been expressed is that, all of the trails will be ADA accessible, but there is a sort of desire to create a loop with a nicer level of accessibility, I would say, because even though something is accepted as accessible, we know that we can do even better sometimes to make that experience.
Yeah. For example, our aggregate trails, if you've been in Central Park in the East Woods, the aggregate trails technically meet ADA standards, but they're not necessarily always the most wheel-friendly paths to go on. So it would be nice to at least have a segment that is truly wheel-friendly. And in this site, it probably needs a boardwalk as opposed. I mean, we're not looking at putting pavements and that type of thing in here. We certainly don't want anything that resembles the Monon Greenway or anything like that. But it would be nice to have at least an opportunity for people with disabilities or mobility challenges to at least get a flavor of what the nature is within the park.
There's additional parking shown in this beyond the sort of medium size parking lot that's represented on the church. We also identified that there is an opportunity along Community Drive as far as the topography goes. And if you were to work within just 25 feet of where the curb line is and sort of working within that 25-foot offset, there is an opportunity to fit maybe 15 parking spaces are shown currently. And also a restroom is shown there. And the reason we really looked hard to try to find a place for a restroom within a zone of, if you look at it, it's about a quarter mile. We drew a half-mile circle from the center point of Prairie Trace Elementary School that's south of the park. And that radius sort of ends right about here. And so we've identified that this section of the park really is kind of the most accessible part of the park for the elementary students to engage with just due to proximity. But knowing that there are, parks, people on the parks team who are heavily involved with the elementary schools, there needs to be a restroom facility to facilitate any kind of engagement there. So we were happy to find that there could be an opportunity to have a restroom facility here in combination with, maybe a little bit of parking. And the other thing that starts to create then is a pretty unique arrival sequence for someone who is coming to visit the park. So imagine you park your car there at the street and you come in, and this woodland is actually a really nice asset as it stands. It's a beautiful little woodland. And so you're within this woodland environment. And then as you walk out of it, you really get this sort of long view of this open natural park space. And it really could be quite dramatic experience this landscape. In this scheme, we have arranged the gathering spot to sort of support that experience, as well as kind of focusing it on maybe, this might be a great place for the students to gather or neighbors to gather, or, kind of fill in the blank. You tell us like what would be great to happen here. But we identified this spot here right at the woodlands edge as a good place for a large gathering node. But in this concept, I would say it's more heavily focused on that 1 to 2 person as far as how we've arranged the gathering nodes. This is more heavy on that. I'm going to move on to the third scheme, which is, we started out calling the least common denominator and sort of moved it to being called the framework plan. And we had a question along the process of engaging with all the different groups, in that, if this is to be a park and this landscape is so very special, and we really don't want anything to change how special it is, what's sort of the lightest touch of a park? What's the lightest kind of gesture of a park, that would support the usage and the connection to the broader community, connecting the broader community to this beautiful place, but not overwhelming, the neighborhood with the activities, around a park. And so it was a fun exercise to look at what would be the lightest touch. I'm going to move to the diagram. I like talking to the diagram. It's nice and easy. So we have this loop trail, and basically a central trail that divides it into 2 spaces. And so what we started to land on is that the takeaway from this kind of trail layout is that it does really amplify the landscape that is there, and that there's not much interruption to it with the trail system. It's pretty easy to navigate in that there's 2 loops. And then we really focus on, where do you bring people into the trail? But beyond that, the major defining characteristic of this is the sort of minimum amount of parking that has been shown and developed. And where the parking is fit in is actually by sort of adding street parking along the northwest corner of the park. There's an opportunity to fit some parking in here as well along the north side of the woodland. And so we kind of like that idea, in that, it's like, what we're providing parking and access and potential overlooks without even touching, the special aspects of, what the park is today and what the land is today. Within this scheme, it made some sense to explore the idea of a restroom up here on the northwest corner. And something we haven't talked about yet is that while this is a grass kind of lawn area now, in the future, it's zoned and, will be developed into more commercial node and activity. And so in a way, again, you can kind of start to imagine a pretty vibrant streetscape supporting, the commercial usage there and continuing to support, the residences that are there, but then also sort of along the eastern and the southern edge of those streetscapes, really creating the beginnings of a park experience, and an overlook. So
one of the things that this framework concept does too is this is one, what if, we're ultimately not successful in coming up with a partnership with Harvest Church? Not saying that we will, not saying that we won't, but, we wanted to have one example that said, okay, worst case scenario, we aren't able to come up with something with Harvest Church. What does that mean? So this is sort of the idea of what that reflects as well.
mm-hmm.
And I apologize, because we were here to get it. The sign says an open house, not necessarily a meeting. So what is the actual goal of the park?
Oh, sure.
I apologize.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean,
So we established basically 5 primary goals for the park. We know that because of the lay of the land, there's a lot of things that it can't be. It's not going to be able to support major development. So the idea is to preserve the natural elements of it, to accommodate passive usage. And by that, we typically mean trail walking, enjoying nature, providing educational or telling the story of the site, both the ecological as well as the human history of the site, embracing connectivity to the neighborhoods, connectivity to the trail networks that exist in the area, and getting people to it, as well as connectivity of partnerships with potential organizations. And then in general, using an innovative approach to partnerships that we do establish, whether that be working with Ball State University and their Applied Anthropology Lab to work with Native American tribes that have a history on the site, or also working with the Indiana Department of Natural Resources to see if there's some opportunities for funding for some of the natural enhancements that could be available on the site.
Right now, it's well known for those around it that it's almost kind of a nature preserve.
Mm-hmm.
But the wildlife in there is, arguably like nothing else in Hamilton, in southern Hamilton County, in your Nobles of Westfield, Fisher's Carmel.
Mm-hmm.
It's already thought to try and preserve that.
Very much so.
Where you got a trail going through there in the middle. I mean, every spring there's 1 or 2 fawns that are born there every spring. Of course, they will be there when the trail goes through.
What we find is the parks that we've developed within the park system and within Carmel Clay Parks and Recreation, 80% of our over 640 acres are preserved in a natural state. We are the first park system in the state of Indiana that is designated as wildlife friendly. So we're very focused on making sure that we're providing natural habitat. And part of it is, while this site doesn't have a lot of invasive species, it also doesn't have a lot of native species. So the plants and elements that we have in a lot of the site are not necessarily what is most ideal for the wildlife that it's supporting. So our goal would be to provide the types of wildflowers and plants that would be more native to them, that actually gives them a healthier, better diet.
And I appreciate that. My only thought is we put people in the middle, the animals are gone.
So in the different schemes that we're showing tonight, and the feedback I think I'm hearing from you too, is that it sounds like especially in the center part of the park, that's a bit of a special place. Or is that what I was hearing?
We live in the townhomes and we overlook it. And I work for myself from home. So every single day I'm on the phone staring out the window. And it's nothing to walk to the back window, especially in the winter, and see 8 to 12 deer.
Mhm.
And like I said, every spring since we've been there, there's been, baby deer being raised out there, except for 1 year coyotes got them. It's nothing to look out there at different times of the year and see 4 or 5 coyotes, hunting field mice. It's arguably one of the most amazing places I've lived all over Carmel and Fishers. We moved from the village of West Clay, and it's so unique. It's like you've got, I'd love to see it called the preserve, or because you actually have a nature preserve there. You've got a place where people can come at any given time and see 8 to 12 deer run across. And if you're lucky, you're going to see 2 or 3 coyote out there hunting field mice, or you're going to see, red-tailed hawk, or even an eagle hunt.
That's so great. That's nice to hear.
Yeah, as I explained at the beginning of the meeting too, under our park classifications, we are looking at it as a nature preserve. So it is going to have a light touch in the ultimate development. But the one thing that is a given is that we will be developing the park. There will be trails in here, which was part of the original plan unit development for the park. So, that's already established as something that will be happening. But one of the things that we are very dedicated to is making sure that we are protective of the wildlife. Like I said, that's very sensitive to us. My office is in Central Park, arguably the busiest park in all of Carmel. And it's not uncommon for me, and I've got a trail not too far from where my window is, to see 5 deer playing as well, and have deer that are raised there as well. So what I can assure you is that the way we develop parks takes that in mind, and we typically don't see less wildlife. We ultimately see more wildlife, even though there's people invited to the park as well.
Yeah, and that was one thing too we did talk about a little bit earlier, is that the soils here actually supported a pretty unique landscape. And if we were able to sort of help bring some of those elements back of that landscape, that flora, it would attract even more fauna and some different things that don't exist now, specific dragonflies, specific birds and animals that could just kind of continue to create more diverse attractions and amplify the things that you really like about it now. Well, I wanted to just introduce, of course, the people who are here tonight see that there's a packet, kind of a worksheet activity that we've created to get more feedback, get more detailed feedback from you on the park. And of course, we're happy to continue to have conversations up here at the boards as well. But for the people who are online, there's also a virtual option to fill out these forms and to get your feedback. I'll go really quickly through them just to give you a understanding of how the worksheets and what the goal is with them. But the first sheet is really about, we've listed some passive usages and which ones of these do you think that you would support having here? And maybe there's some that we haven't thought about that you think should be included in a park like this. And then beyond that, we start to break down each of those different elements that we described in the concepts. And we've shown them on each concept and where they're located. And so, for instance, on the nodes, we want to know, are there enough gathering areas? Would you rather see more small ones, or would you rather, just any information that this kind of thought about gathering nodes might create.
And one of the things that's important as you're looking at each of these pages too, in the comment sections, what we're interested in is if there's things about it that one of the concepts that are shown there that you like, put that down. But if there's things that you also don't like, that we want to hear that as well. So we're looking at both of that feedback. And like we said at the beginning too, none of these are necessarily what the plan's going to be. What we did is based on the original feedback we've received in the focus groups we've had so far, is come up with some concepts that reflected some of the things we were hearing. And we put them up on these illustrations because what we find is the words that people use are what passive means to one person can be active to another person. So what we try to do is put these concepts together so that you get an idea of what we heard, and that allows us to better understand, did we interpret what we've heard in the past from previous groups accurately reflect that? Yes, sir.
in the evening, or just do it online?
You
up
could
to you.
either,
Yeah.
either or. So, or you can do both, quite frankly. So, no, we'll keep it online for at least 2 weeks.
Mhm. Yeah, so then we break down, the trail system and the parking locations and sizes, restroom locations, and, again, quantity, how many restrooms do you think? And then we have some sheets about each concept individually, and we're asking you to rate them based on the goals that have been set forth, as well as just your preference. Is there one that stands out as preferable to you? And then lastly, we sort of have an activity that we'd like you to consider doing, in that if you were to lay out these different elements, where would you like to see a trail place? Where would you think is the best spot for a restroom or parking? So also, if there's things, again, that we haven't included on this legend, like when we were in the middle school, we had some great suggestions of additions to our legend, as far as what we should have included. But
Many
feel
of
free
which
to,
are not feasible
yeah.
for this park. But
Yeah. Great creative ideas. But you can create your own symbols, and those symbols can be as simple as a circle. You could put a circle for everything that you want and just label it, and we will know, that will be enough for us. So this isn't an artistic endeavor as much as just share your thoughts with us, and we're really interested to know more. Go ahead. Do you have a question?
You're involved with what Concord is thinking on the other side of the street. So I'm really curious because I think there's huge opportunities for this to be a flowing area. I mean, you talk about 60 acre here, the other side of the street with Concord Prairie, it's probably a couple hundred acres over there. Even to be as bold to say at some point, you look at the street that says you don't even have a road in that 100-yard stretch because you've got access all the way around. Where you could have a 250 acre continuous flow of the prairie and native plants. So what's on the other side of the street? I mean, because you want ideas, but
sure.
I don't know what's on the other side of the street. You have that information.
So what I do know, and it's my understanding that Concord Prairie is working on some proposals that they're going to be presenting to the city of Carmel through the Plan Commission and ultimately the city council. Yeah, so I think they're within a few months of having some ideas based on preliminary plans that I've seen. What they've talked about over there is really kind of tying the property they have in Fishers a little bit over to here, having like a bridge. And on the north side, they've talked about creating a new museum experience that they've called the Food, Farm, and Energy Experience that interprets kind of the history of farming, but also the future of farming. A little bit further south, one of the things that Carmel Clay Parks and Recreation and Concord Prairie have been discussing as well is the potential for a White River Education and Ecology Center. So that would be kind of a nature center that's focused on the river and the greater watershed there. That would be more kind of a nature center, but water focused, if you will. A little bit to the south, they've talked about maybe a farm to fork table, potential innovation center where maybe different partners, organizations, entities that are focused on land, water, and energy can collaborate and have a think group, if you will, there. And maybe to the south, they've even talked about like boutique lodging, maybe some cabins and those types of things. Those are concepts. I haven't seen the PUD, so PUD, so I don't know what they're proposing, but yes, exactly.
So, I mean, the idea, just thinking real quick, what I saw this earlier was in this area where they have a variety of development ideas, but you're from a native area. And of course, next to the river, there's a lot of native areas.
Absolutely.
Is there a 100-yard wide area or whatever where it's a flowing, continuous native? So
one of the things that we're also working with Concord Prairie on that kind of creates a little bit of a buffer, at least for the southern half of their property, is Carmel Clay Parks and Recreation currently has the White River Greenway, which ends at about Tall Timber Trail. We own the property, about 15 acres immediately north of where the trail ends. So we're looking at extending the trail there, maybe putting a trailhead so that there's parking, because we know that folks park in the neighborhoods there. So a place so that people that are traveling can go there. And then further north, continuing on Concord Prairie's property along the river, basically about to Cherry Creek Boulevard. So in between the trail and stuff, that would be all preserved, and so you sort of have this sort of natural ribbon that protects the development to the south there. It's a beautiful stretch of the river. I actually walked it about a week and a half ago, and it's absolutely stunning. So, but the idea is that, you know, the trails here, I mean, that would be a multi-purpose trail, very similar to the existing. But over here, the nature trails for those that are so inclined, you know, it provides kind of a natural contemplative excursion off the trail.
Yeah, but if you want to, you can just use this time to work through the worksheets, and we are here and can kind of.
Absolutely.
work
And like we
answer
said,
questions
I
too.
mean, you're welcome to take these with you if you're not prepared to give your comments. We do have online, if you go to carmelclayparks.com, you can basically do an online version of this. We encourage you to share it with your neighbors, your friends. We're wanting to get as much feedback as possible because the power of our park system here in Carmel is that we really do try to listen to the interests of and what folks within the community want, and incorporate that into the ultimate design of the park. So we are interested in that feedback, and certainly encourage you to. It's sort of like Chicago. You can vote once, vote often. So.
And this is recorded, and so if you do have neighbors that miss the presentation, it will be available on the website as well. So just know that as well. Oh,
Yeah, yes, I'm sorry.
I was late, so I don't know if you mentioned this. What's the timeline that you're looking at?
Thank you.
Sure. So for the planning process, our next touch point with the community will be in July, where we'll take the feedback we're receiving, look at, and basically come up with a refined concept that probably doesn't look exactly like any of these, but incorporates the additional feedback we're receiving. We'll ask for additional feedback from the community on that. Once we have that, then we will ultimately present it to the park board, which will probably be a month or so after, so July, August, September timeframe, that it gets presented to the park board for consideration. Once it's adopted, the reality is part of the master planning process is creating the vision and getting a general idea of what it might cost to construct. And then we have to look at our funding availability and work with elected and community leaders to figure out how that process is going to be funded, and that'll kind of drive how quickly it happens. But probably at the absolute earliest, our next step would be then starting to create the schematic designs, or more detailed designs, as opposed to sort of the more illustrative ones. At the earliest, we're probably looking at about a year and a half before that could happen, probably more realistically in that 2-year time frame. And before any construction starts, we're looking, well, probably more than 2 years. There might be a little bit of trail, or, if utilities is doing anything to bring their wells on, there might be some overlooks that look with that, but that's separate from this park project. Well, again,
Already thought of some sort of elevated overlook sort of thing.
I'm sorry?
Has there ever been thought of some sort of elevated overlook sort of thing, because that's how you actually see the wildlife out there?
There has been. Carmel Utilities has 2 wellhead locations within the property. If you go out there now, you can see the casings. What they're doing, and they're actually working with MKSK. It's not part of our master planning process, but we'll factor in that into ultimately our plans. Is they're looking at, instead of having an ugly typical well house that you would see in the floodplain, they're looking at dressing it up and having some overlooks so that you do get that vistas into the park.
If you were to stand on the leftover material that's south of this,
Right.
Here, and if you were to stand up there, which takes you about maybe 18 feet above grade,
Absolutely.
maybe 25 feet above the grade in there, it's the view. What you get is completely different.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Similarly, in the commercial node, there's a really wonderful view back there that's really tall, and that's a really nice idea to think about. That being up high and being able to sort of view what's happening below without impacting.
But that's if you allow the wildlife to stay.
That's right. Yeah.
If you put the trails through the wildlife zone.
Yeah, well, one thing, we are meeting with different environmentalists and ecologists and specialists within, horticulture. And we haven't met with that focus group yet on this round, but I think that happens tomorrow. And I think we'd probably love to bring some of those questions and concerns you have to them and help us understand, what breadth or what area of land do some of these different activities you're mentioning require to support, so that we can sort of look at that and plan for that. if
Well,
possible.
and like I said, we know from our own experiences that
That's
when
right.
we improve the natural environment, that we don't detract and scare animals away, we actually attract more.
Yeah, and
Yeah, but
this,
I've never seen a deer running through one of the parks.
Well, I have.
yeah, yeah. But we do hear your concern and are definitely keeping it in mind.
Well, again, I want to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to share it with us, to give us feedback, to learn more about the planning process. And we hope to see you all in July. We'll give notices again to try to attract. We'll also promote it on our social media at our website, so keep a lookout there as well. But thank you very much, and we'll stick around. So if there's any one-on-one questions, we're happy to talk with you. But thank you very much.
Thank you.